Hi, welcome back to another TerranScapes video. This is just a special short video, I'm going to try to keep it short, on how I've been evolving into different forms of casting. I just put up a video about some new buildings that I did, and they're cast as whole pieces, so that requires a different kind of molding than what most people use, say when they're making a small block, two-part mold for casting small objects. So what I thought I'd do is give you a brief overview of how this process is done, at least for me. And then in the description down below, I'm going to link to the Smooth On video. Smooth On is a manufacturer of plastics and urethanes and rubber, silicone rubbers, whatnot, for casting and mold making. And they have a video that's how I learned this, and it's nice. It's very step by step, and it is important that you follow each and every step to get it to come out right. So I'll let them do the specifics, and I'll give you a brief overview of how it works for me. So if you want, you could pause right now and go watch that video, and then come back, and you'll understand maybe more about what I'm talking about. Because people tend to get confused when I explain some of the steps, and they have trouble abstracting how this all comes together. So if you don't watch their video and you're confused after this, it will make more sense then. So here's the master of the mausoleum. Now when you go to cast using this method, in this particular case because I'm using Hurst Arts molds, I have to make sure that it's completely sealed. So depending on what you cast, you may not need to do this, but that meant going around, I actually fill everything with lightweight spackle, brush it all out, take my time. Deep areas I'll put in some green stuff, but you can see it's a hollow building. You can see the reinforcing I did for the roof, and that's what the master looks like. So basically, it requires attaching the master to a foundation. They recommend screwing it into place because this has no bottom and I can't screw through the board. I don't cast on this surface, I cast elsewhere, but I just often glue it down using hot glue or super glue. I've been using more because it's a little stronger and it doesn't lift up the model. Once you seal it, because it is hollow on the inside, I then have to seal every little edge and nook and cranny. I use a soft modeling clay for that. You have to use specific clays, research that if you're going to get into this kind of process. Then, once you do that, you take saran wrap, wrap it over the whole model, and then you build up a layer of clay. I'm using Plasticon. It's a modeling clay from, I can't remember what modeling company, but if you Google Plasticon modeling clay, sculpting clay, you'll find it. It's a very soft-bodied clay. You build up a layer, the thickness that's going to be the end result of your rubber. So in this case, I built it up, about a 1/4 inch thick, ballpark. Then, with the clay in place and your model firmly attached, you have to build a shell around the model. I use Plastipaste from Smooth On. It's a fiberglass reinforced epoxy. It is incredibly strong. This is probably thicker than it needs to be. You build your shell around the model, and you have to envision now, this is where the imagination comes in. Make sure I got the right corner here. There we go. That you have a layer of clay now that you're building the shell around. Now, because this model has outcroppings and whatnot, it'd be easy to lock it into the shell, meaning that once you build the shell, you won't be able to remove it. So you have to make sure that you build it in parts that have seams that conform to the master so that you'll be able to remove it. In this case, I opted for 4/4, as that way it runs the seam of the roof and it runs the seam of the small, I should come up with a name for those. What are those little things? The alcoves that stick out on the side. Once you build the shell, you need to have a vent hole to pour in your rubber. You need to build the feet for it so that when you turn it upside down to cast into it, it'll be level and sturdy. You need to build flanges to give the seams strength, as you're going to use those to pry it apart. You need to build flanges on the side to trap whatever kinds of strapping material you're going to use. All of this is, model specific. Then, once you have this all attached, you key it, don't forget, keying it in. They'll show you that on the video, so that it all comes together nice and neat and makes a good tight fit. Once you build the shell, then you also key the shell to the foundation, as it needs to go over the model the exact same way it does right now. You're going to take the shell off. You're going to peel off all the clay, and that will leave you now a void between the shell and the model. So if you can imagine, do I have this in the right spot? There we go. So if you can imagine here, right, there is a gap now, an air gap between the model and the shell. So you return the shell to its original position using the keys on the foundation. Seal it. You have to seal the entire thing with, I use hot glue. It works really well. It's easy to remove. Screw it into the table. This is important. I forgot to do this the very first time I tried this, and I had rubber bubbling out from underneath because the rubber is so dense, the shell actually floated off even on the hot glue. It broke all the hot glue seams. I had $40 of rubber racing away from me. That was a problem. You may need to drill air holes to vent this. That's model specific as well. I figured because the peak is the highest point, I didn't need to put a vent hole in it, and I got lucky, and I'll show you why. Once this is all sealed, locked to the table, exactly the way it was over the miniature, so you have that nice even air gap, then you pour your rubber into the hole. The rubber you choose, of course, is up to you. I happen to be using right now, this is Mold Max 15. It's a platinum silicone rubber. It's relatively inexpensive for platinum silicones. It's a 1-to-1 mix ratio, and it has been holding up to resin casting awesome. I've been super impressed with this rubber. I tried Mold Max 30, and it sucks. Mold Max 15. In any case, then, once the rubber has cured entirely, depending on the rubber you use, depending on the time, depending on the temperature, blah, blah, blah. Then you remove your shell, you peel off all your sealings, you break this shell gently apart using a, so I use screwdrivers and putty knives and, lever it all apart. There's a whole bunch of steps about sealing the models, sealing this I've not talked about. You have to investigate that. They'll mention some of that in the video if you want to get further into it. And then basically what you end up with is something that looks like this, where you have the rubber now, and then you can demold the rubber from your master. Now you set your master aside. Now you reassemble your shell. Alright, hold on here. If this takes me a while, I'll time-lapse it. Stay. I'm using straps, like utility straps, to lock these models together, these shells. They're pretty quick and easy to use. Sometimes, depending on the size of your mold, you might be able to use electrical tape. There's a whole variety of ways to do any of these steps, different kinds of materials for shells. There's plenty of customization. But you'll notice here how the strap goes underneath here. Because the Plastipaste is relatively smooth, without having these catches to catch on the lip, it tends to slide up because of the shape of the structure. So once you get it in place, oh, wait a minute, I'm doing it the wrong direction here. It's not often I do this on camera, like never. And you want to crank that down pretty aggressively, especially because I'm using expanding foams. So expanding foams, I have discovered, if you don't crank them enough, they'll distort the shell, right? They'll push the shell apart and you'll get a distorted cast. I happen to use a second one on the top here to ensure the top is tight. One of the things I like about the Plastipaste is this is incredibly strong, so I can crank on this about as much as I want, and I'll break the wood before I break the Plastipaste. Then, now you have your empty shell. Alright. And now, see if that's still on frame, it is. And then you take your rubber from your demolded master, and you reinsert it into your mother mold, your mother shell. This has to be keyed as well to make sure it fits in properly. You have to have a certain flange around it, again, a little investigation required there. And then, I often double check to make sure it's seated at the roof, as this is a particularly likely area for it to buckle, and then I'll have a distorted roof line. So I press it all in, make sure it's good to go. And then for a building like this, to cast into it, complicated molds before I leave. Sometimes you can create keys in the you'd basically make a key in the clay, so to speak, that the rubber will key into the shell, so that you could have a firmer lock. That's something that I'll probably have to do with larger. This is probably about as large as I can go without getting into complicated keying. We're going to ignore the phone. So then what I do is then I use a release agent, I spray it out, I add talcum powder to it, I dust all of that out to give it a little more capillary action to grip into the small detail. This is typical of the way Bruce Hurst does his plastic casting. That's where I got the talcum powder trick. Jesus Christ. It's a lot to go over. So I talcum powder the inside after spraying it with a release agent. Then I mix up my plastic for the shell. Now, if this was round, in my other buildings, if you notice, there were towers, they're columns, then what I'm doing is I'm hand rotocasting it. So I'm pouring it in, and then I turn the model until the resin sets up. And the rate that takes is up to the type of resin that you use. What I'm using sets in about 20 minutes, so I'm actually spinning it for a little while. It's heat activated as well, so depending on the temperature, all those things affect it. But in this instance, because of the size of this piece and its shape, if I try to rotate it around, it's going to be slopping out of all these corners when I turn it like this, right? It just pours out instead of slopping to this side. So what I do is I do a lot of rotation as much as I can without spilling it to help get the thin plastic into some of the tiny details that are hidden, especially in the undercuts. I want to get them coated really well. Then I get a cheap chip brush. Pretend this is a chip brush. This is not. Pretend. And then I'll brush it up all along the sides as it begins to set to try to ensure as even a coverage as I can. It's a very tricky process with this kind of a model because it has so many nooks and crannies and undercuts. But for the most part, if you get at least a thin layer of plastic, you'll capture the detail and then the foam will back that up. So I don't worry about it too much, but I do try the entire time it's setting until it starts to get to a taffy stage, in which case then I'm going to mess it up more than help by curing plastic away from the sides, which you don't want to do. Once the plastic is set up, then it's going to look just like this, but it's going to look white on the inside. It's still going to be this giant void. To give it strength, I then pour in an expanding foam, which is kind of like the gap filling foam that you use in, for gap cracking. Gap cracking. Don't laugh at that. That you use to fill cracks or gaps in your walls of your house, right? It's like that, except I use a two-part urethane foam so I can control its mixing, and I don't have aerosol cans are expensive. It's a little bit cheaper that way. And I can control the volume ratios and the density of the foam by using different kinds of foams. You pour that in. One second. I'm back. You pour that in, and then you need a backing board for expanding foams. Now, the video, you will not see this because this is not what they're casting into it. They solid cast it in plastic. Crazy expensive, but that's what they do in the video. So if you want to use expanding foams, the foam is going to expand. It's going to rise like a bubble, and you don't want a bubble in the center and all these empty gaps around the edges. So what you do is you use a smooth board. This is hardboard. It's my modeler's friend. This is what I always recommend people to base their terrain on. Drill some holes to release pressure and to release excess material. Pour your foam in there. I actually, for this model, I then do a lot of rocking and controlling of the expansion of the foam because it's such an odd shape. That's not always needed. This is a little tricky. Then release agents. Place it on top. Hold it down with your hands. Hold it down with weights. And then as the foam rises, some will escape from these vents, but the rest of it will be pushed to the sides, and you'll get a good fill, and you can increase the density slightly by applying more pressure. But if you overfill it, there's no way you can hold it down. I've had 40 or 50 pounds of weight on top of some of these trying to keep the foam from going crazy, and it just pushes it up like it's nothing. Chemistry at work, So you do need to have the right number of vents, not overfill it, have a good amount of weight on it, have a shell that's strong enough to hold the weight and the pressure straps that'll keep it from expanding and pushing apart the mold. Once that's all cured, shave off the excess, break off the bottom board, and you'll have your filled building. And you'll end up with a building that will look like that. So you can see here, I did not fill it properly the first time, and I had to go back in and touch it up. I often don't measure per se per model because I have so many different kinds of casts. I eyeball it, and sometimes I'm a little off, especially if I haven't been casting in a while. Once you demold it, then you can sand the bottom flat, and you'll end up with the model that I showed in the last video. Just like that. Oh, just like that. One of the things that's lucky about this mold, I was really concerned, is that when I go to demold, am I able, do I have to cut a seam? Oftentimes you have to cut a seam to be able to peel the rubber off. Probably looks better on this. You know, so I might cut a seam traditionally up the back, and then you can zipper open the rubber to remove it. I'm able to get the rubber off of this model as a single piece. We call it a glove mold when it's like that. And you can stretch it off and pull it off, and that way it's a perfectly seamless model, and I don't have to worry about a seam, you know, either in the cleanup or in the setting of the rubber into the shell. You can try to get a tight seam and it doesn't show that much, but there's almost always a little bit there. So, just as a, you know, it's never entirely perfect, and I do end up, this is these little spots right here on the underside of these little brackets are the trickiest spots to fill. This is one of the trickiest pieces to fill with plaster as well, for the same reason. They're so small, it's very hard to get them to completely fill, but otherwise the entire model has cast with excellent reproduction every time almost, and errors have been my fault, not the process. So that's an overview of how this building gets cast. So that's a rapid-fire overview of how to do this kind of a mold, which is actually called a cavity fill mold, and it, you know, name derived from the fact that you're creating an empty cavity inside around the master that you then fill with the rubber. There's a lot of steps to the setup. It takes you know, quite a few hours to put the mold together, and there's plenty of steps that require real careful attention to detail, making sure everything is sealed, the master sealed to the table, everything is keyed, make sure that you have release agents on all the spots, and so I would not recommend this for the inexperienced caster. You're much better starting off with a simple block mold, two-part, and then building from there once you get a handle of the general basics of casting. But I do know that there are a few people who watch my channel who have been doing some casting, and I've seen some interesting structures, and you know, I always feel like the market is big enough to support everybody knowing as much as they can. So hopefully you find this a little helpful and may steer you in some other directions. And this is not, of course, the only way to cast this kind of a building. It's just a method that I find is fairly helpful. It's relatively straightforward to set up, and has one nice bonus that's not often mentioned. But because the shell is permanent, once the rubber deteriorates, assuming I can line everything up right, and I have done it before, so it can be done, you can then recenter the shell over the original master and re-pour another mold without having to go through quite a bit of the setup. So it should make reproducing the mold much faster down the road once it deteriorates, as all rubbers break down in the, you know, when you're casting resins into them. While this has had, I've gotten probably 50 casts maybe out of some of these, looking great. The rubber's still in great shape, using plastic, so I may never need to do this one again. But should I need to down the road, it would be about a fifth of the time to set up that mold again, and a lot cheaper as well, as I'll have all the materials from the shell to reuse. So it's got some advantages over some other techniques. Hopefully you found it useful. I should be back pretty soon with an update on the Imperial sector, so keep your eyes peeled for that, and thank you once again for joining me.